Hello, everybody. Welcome to your next session. This is Trends in Climate Finance. My name is Tyler Hamilton. I'm Senior Director of Climate at Mars Discovery District, and it's a pleasure to have you all here today. As the urgency to address climate change grows, we know the field of climate finance is evolving rapidly. This panel is going to explore the latest trends in climate finance and discuss their implications for Canadian leaders. Our expert panelists will delve into investor trends, innovative financing models, emerging investment opportunities, and the evolving political and regulatory landscape. We'll also gain valuable insights into the changing dynamics of climate finance and learn how to navigate the complexities of funding sustainable projects. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce our three panelists. Mike Thiessen, Chief Investment Officer of Genus Capital Management. Julie Siegel, Senior Manager, Climate Finance at Environmental Defense, and Namendra Anand, Impact Director of Climate, Carbon and Nature at the North Pine Foundation. Welcome, the three of you. So to kick it off, I'm going to start with just a softball question here, 2 minutes each. What's your story? What's your role? Why did you get involved in impact investing? And why don't we start with Julie?
Great, thanks. Really glad to be here for the first virtual social finance forum. I'm currently I lead a climate finance policy program at Environmental Defense Canada, where I'm working to advance essentially rules, regulation that align the whole financial system with social finance, like we're working here today, and specifically climate finance. A bit of background how I got into that. I worked in impact investing, managed a impact investing portfolio at the McConnell Foundation for about 5 years, and really loved the work there. So we were able to make positive investments in the climate transition reconciliation. But as ESG and sustainable finance started to grow in name, at least in the market, I kind of took a step back and thought, whoa, we're doing great things with this portfolio, but a lot of what we see labeled as ESG elsewhere isn't really delivering what we would define as impact investing and what should be defined as impact investing. So I switched into this role to try and affect the way policy works in the financial system to ideally shift everything towards impact investing and sustainable finance in a really credible way. Because of course, every investment does have an impact on the real world, and we should certainly be making that a positive impact.
Great, thanks, Julie. Namendra, what's your role? What's your story?
Sure. Thanks, Tyler. My name is Namendra Anand, working as Impact Director. I'm leading the Climate, Carbon and Nature portfolio at North Pine Foundation. North Pine Foundation is a private foundation, and we are trying to do the impact investment as well as grant making. And my focus is how do we enable end users? How do we enable investees with the venture philanthropy mindset? Because what I have seen is grant is perfect, but it has its own limitation. And in one way, it creates a dependency when we look at the ventures, when we look at the investees. So we are trying to walk on the path of venture philanthropy and working towards impact investment, considering climate and nature as the end beneficiary. So when we see the financial system, it is a man-made system, and we created rules around the system. So everybody understand the return in terms of financial return within that system. And when we talk about impact, when we look at the investment from climate and nature perspective, it's a totally different worldview. Everybody understand the growth. Same thing with the foundation, with the private equity. There is a wealth which is being diverted for climate and environment. The wealth is growing exponentially. Then the question is, how do we calibrate the path that we are on, and how do we calibrate the trajectory where we want to move forward with this capital deployment, with creating new solutions? Because there are so many innovative ventures out there who are trying to develop new solutions or refining the existing solution with the technology, with the available capital. So it is really crucial to understand the whole picture and try to identify right kind of potential players who will lead the momentum for climate solutions and nature solutions. That's my story in short.
Terrific. Yeah, and focus on you mentioning ventures like as you know, Mars works with over 240 across Canada at this very moment, and there's a lot of tremendous innovation happening right now. It's quite inspiring, and trying to get those companies to scale to impact is super important. Mike, over to you.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so I'm Mike Thiessen. I'm the co-CIO at Genis Capital, also the Chief Sustainability Officer at Genis. So I focus on leading our investment team at Genis and also leading the sustainable initiatives. So here we have a suite of sustainable funds. So we have a suite of responsible funds that focus on ESG integration and lowering carbon emissions in the portfolio. Then we have a suite of fossil-free funds focusing on cutting out kind of the negative players when it comes to climate change. And then we have a suite of impact funds where we're not only taking out the negative companies, but we're adding in positive. We're adding in the companies that are moving us further towards climate action. And so within that impact suite, we have public equities, we have green bonds, and then we also have an impact investment council, which focuses on building custom portfolios for individuals, for foundations that want a customized portfolio across all asset classes. So private equity, venture capital, green buildings, public equities around the impact that they're wanting to make, which is primarily climate finance. So that's what we're really focused on. We're a certified B Corp at Genis, so we're really striving to be a source for good as an asset manager, especially in this space.
Great. It's nice to have some diverse perspectives on this panel. Next question I'm going to also ask of the three of you, partly because, when we hear the term climate finance, when I hear the term climate finance, it's a pretty broad term, right? And it may mean different things to different people. So I'm going to ask each of you, what does it mean to you? Is it climate justice financing? Is it sustainable finance? For your particular line of work, what's the lens through which you look at climate finance? So I'm going to go back to Julie.
Great. I can start with a bit of a broad definition here, because you're right. People tend to look at climate finance defined in very different ways. I'd say the main categories here are public and private climate finance. The United Nations definition of climate finance talks about both types of capital, both private and public at all different levels, moving towards building climate resilience in building a low greenhouse gas economy. So reducing emissions, building resilience. That's essentially what climate finance means. When we're looking at the public side, that's more the climate justice finance. So recognizing that countries like Canada have polluted far more than, about the same as the entire continent of Africa. And so we owe a bit of a climate debt. But when we're looking at private finance, which is more or less the focus of the audience here, I would imagine, that's talking about how investors, banks, pension funds, retail investors can shift capital, frankly, out of polluting investments and into solution investments. When it comes to investing in climate finance from the private side, about $4.3 trillion of investment is needed. That's about a 20% year over year growth from now until 2030. Every single year, 20% increase in the amount of capital flowing to climate from the private sector. So hugely important, great to be focused on that, but showing that we need to move quite a bit further. Another tricky part about climate finance, I talked about both reducing emissions, called mitigation often, and building resilience, thought of as adaptation. Now, about 90% of capital goes towards mitigation finance, but we can see that we're already experiencing the damages of climate change. About 1.1 degrees of warming are locked in. We need to keep that below 1.5 to avoid the worst damages. But with 1.1 degrees of warming, we're experiencing wildfires in every single province in Canada in May and June. So quite a bit of investment needs to happen globally. And we're seeing some examples of what needs to happen here in Canada, but globally to ensure that communities across the world are more resilient to the locked-in effects of climate change. So about 5 to 10% going to adaptation right now. That's tougher to invest in for the private sector, but really, really needs to be scaled up. And in fact, every mitigation investment, every regular investment needs to start thinking about climate adaptation.
Yeah, and it's not, I imagine, not just about shifting over resources from mitigation over to adaptation. It's about still growing both, but creating a better balance across.
Exactly.
Yeah. Mike.
Yeah, so I would have a similar definition there. Where from what we're seeing kind of within our firm, we're seeing basically the same stats as what Julie was saying. So we're seeing a lot more focus on mitigation because, to be honest, it's a lot easier to do, to cut out the negative impact that you're making, rather than focusing on what you can do positively to build resilience. So we're seeing a lot of traditional portfolios shift into more mitigation type portfolios, which is exciting. But in terms of overall definitions, I think that we're kind of right in line there.
And is that because it's difficult, because it's harder to calculate the value of adaptation, of what you're preventing from happening in the future and the unknowns around that, versus a mitigation where it's much more established methodology for calculating that?
Yeah, I think it's more established methodology, better data. It's lower risk because you're investing in industries that already exist and you're trying to make them better, rather than creating new businesses, new industries. So that's an area that people want to focus on. It's lower risk now. It might not be lower risk in the future. And so I think it's just a more gradual step for investors, rather than jumping right to adaptation.
Got it. Namendra, does this all align with your thinking? Does it resonate?
Yep.
Yep.
What Mike and Julie said is perfectly in alignment with my thought process and what I have seen being as an investor or funder. The key question is climate finance can be understood in different ways. So it has different meaning for the investee. It has different meaning for investor. Because if we talk about the portfolio management, entire goal of a portfolio might be something different than climate or environment benefit.
Mm-hmm.
So the key question is, how do we explain this language of climate and environment benefit to the larger investment and funder community? ESG is one of the language that has been developed to explain it. But in my experience, that has been developed as a reporting tool, as a measurement and data creation tool. But if we take the concept a little bit broader, and if we try to understand this with COVID scenario, something happened in the world. Everybody was after the solution. They were not talking about what amount of $1 billion were required.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone was going after the solution by any means. So when I look at the investor in this community, I think that is the right meaning of climate finance, that as a human society, we need those solutions to be developed. And most of them we already have in practice. We have so many innovative groups out there who are trying to make it mainstream commercial solution. So it is the matter of how do we shift our focus from traditional business practices to more climate and environment friendly business practices. So if we quantify the total fund requirement in terms of climate finance, it might be, as what Julie mentioned, in terms of quantity of $1 billion requirement. If we consider the philanthropic group within Canada, it's around 120 billion fund available, logged in as a philanthropic fund. Now the matter is, how do we convey this message of climate and environment solutions so that we can utilize this available capital for the benefit of climate innovation and these kind of creative solutions. So that's my experience with the climate finance.
Interesting. Well, thanks for going into that. Mike, I'm going to go back to you. Have you seen investor attitudes towards climate finance change in recent years? And if you have, like, what factors have influenced whatever shift is happening, and are there implications for Canadian leaders in this space?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we've seen a lot of changes in attitudes towards climate finance. Genis built our first climate finance portfolio in 1994. So a very long time ago. We just had some environmental foundations and some individuals and families that were kind of seen as crazy back then, wanting to adapt their portfolio in Canada to be more climate focused. And since then, it's been a slow growth in more foundations, especially wanting to get involved in climate finance, up until about 10 years ago when we started creating a bunch of funds because we saw that more investors were interested in it. And in the last 10 years, we've seen faster growth all the way until 2020 and 2021 when it really hit a peak of interest. I think at that point, the business case was there for a lot of clean tech. The business case was there for a lot of renewables, even without subsidies. And with subsidies, then it really added fuel onto the fire when it came to the economic power of these business models, plus the infrastructure. And then during that time period too, you started seeing more and more floods and fires and kind of the effects of climate change that were affecting the lives of a lot of investors. And so people wanted to make a difference. Plus, they saw the business case for it. Plus, it became kind of the cool thing to do in many ways. And in the stock market, a lot of EV companies, renewable energy companies were skyrocketing too. So people were making money off of it, and that just propelled everybody to want to get into it. So there was massive flows in those 2 years towards climate finance. But then 2022 hit, and everything came kind of tumbling down. 2022, oil and gas spiked. And so energy companies did extremely well in 2022, most of them in Canada, up about 80+%. So a lot of people that were on the fence with climate finance or that were just doing it in order to quickly make some money suddenly shifted. They wanted to get out of it. On top of that, there was a lot of skepticism around climate finance, given that there were a lot of allegations around greenwashing, because in 2020 and 2021, everybody jumped in, all the big banks, all the big asset managers, but they didn't really know what they were doing at the time, and they weren't doing what their marketing was saying that they were doing. So a lot of skepticism. And then, of course, there's the whole political backlash against ESG as well. So there were a lot of negative effects in 2022 towards climate finance. And so flows into climate finance in the US, in Europe, really dropped in 2022. In Canada, they were about flat, just because Canada is so far behind a lot of the world when it comes to climate finance that we're still kind of catching up. So that's why it didn't drop like these other regions. And then in 2023, we're seeing some movement back into climate finance, but not as strong as 2020 or 2021. And so a lot of funds, a lot of companies have really got crushed in the last year that have been wanting to focus on climate finance. So I think some big kind of lessons or implications from this. One is that if you're trying to bring about a movement and you're trying to make something more mainstream, you can't be lying to the public and greenwashing or impact washing or whatever you want to do. You have to actually be doing what you say you're doing. That seems very basic, but it wasn't the case for a lot of entities. And that means that you need to be measuring the impact that you're making. You need to be very transparent about what you're doing, and not just committing yourself to every commitment and association that is out there at the time for PR. You need to think it through and make sure that you're actually going to be able to do it. So that's a big thing. And then I think the other thing is long-term financial sustainability. I think when we talk about climate finance, when we talk about impact investing, we get really excited about the difference that we're making for the world. And I think that's extremely important. But you can't make a large-scale difference if you're not financially sustainable or economically sustainable. So that means for individual businesses, you need a sustainable business model. For investors or asset managers, you need a strategy that has long-term good performance, and then you'll be able to stay in the game longer, and you can make impact longer. And a lot of businesses and funds didn't have these strategies, didn't have a long-term track record. And then when there's a bump in the road, then a lot of them kind of fall apart. And that's not great for the movement either. So I think it's just doing what you say you're doing and then working on long-term financial performance.
So, the doing what you say you're doing, and I throw this out to the whole panel, does any of that have to do with the easiness through which ESG metrics can be gained? Because it really covers a whole range, a spectrum of different KPIs, right? And if you put emphasis on one over another, you can kind of brag about your ESG score, but you could be failing miserably on the climate side, maybe doing well on the S and the G side. Is there an element of that too? And again, curious to hear if other panelists have thoughts there. Don't be shy.
Yeah, I can comment on this if anyone else wants to jump
Sure.
in. I do think that the accessibility of the data does potentially make it easier, but I think it's more a factor of it becoming the cool thing in 2020 and 2021. So all marketing was targeted towards that. And a lot of people just got into anything that said green on it or said electric.
Yeah.
And didn't really even look at the ESG scores that were available, even the most basic ones. Some of the funds were very obvious that it was just an exact replica of another fund that this same bank had, but they just put a different label on it. And people weren't digging any deeper. They just wanted to get into it quickly. So I think that was the big thing. I think it's just marketing.
Marketing. Okay.
I think Mike is pretty right there. The difference within an ESG score, I don't think created many problems. For example, Tesla is a classic story here, which has quite poor governance and social factors. A number of examples, which I don't have to get into now, of course, is strong on the environmental side in terms of the downstream effects of its product. But they didn't rank so well on ESG scores because they were really low on S&G. So I think the problem isn't necessarily a push and pull between ESG. I mean, those should all be working in the same direction, right? It's more about the quality of the data behind each and all of those, as well as the quality of the labels in front of each and all of those. So credit rating agencies were putting out ESG ratings without much transparency about what that means. Funds, were able to label themselves as whatever was trendy without any checks and balances for making sure they actually delivered on what they're promising to, or any repercussions for simply going about marketing. So I think, particularly for retail investors, there's an area of investor protection here, right? Where they shouldn't have to be filing through all of the details of a company or of a fund to know whether it's actually credibly sustainable. And I think it's kind of an area where the rules on what a fund can call itself or label itself or market itself as needs to adapt, because with the onslaught of interest in sustainability, of course, a lot of organizations are going to try and put themselves forward into that. But without any common definition on what sustainable, net zero, climate aligned means, the wild mess is going to continue and can only really be fixed by cleaning up the data and then cleaning up the conclusions, through new guidelines and rules for what can be labeled as sustainable in ESG.
Yeah, on the topic of the data, because we work with earlier stage companies at Mars, we're trying, they shouldn't get off easy either, right? They still have to start thinking about it early. And I think a lot of SMEs have kind of been overlooked as a place to focus ESG, partly because of their size, and it takes resources and effort and expertise to be able to track things appropriately. But we've been trying to work harder with companies at those earlier stages to build it into the DNA. So even though they're not in a position to start tracking it and reporting on it at that stage, at least they're learning about it until they know when they get to the stage, these are the things we have to consider, so that when we become a bigger, maybe publicly traded company, they're doing it right, and they know that they're not going to get away with greenwashing, nor do they want to be perceived as greenwashing. I just add that because I bring the SME perspective to this discussion as well. I'm going to go to Namendra. I'm curious to know what you think are some innovative financing models or mechanisms that have emerged in the field of climate finance. And have they been successful in attracting investment? And if you have any examples that you can cite, that would be great.
Yeah, thanks, Tyler. And it's so encouraging to listen to you when you were talking about early stage companies, because all the climate finance it looks different for early stage investment in the early stage ventures due to their limitations in resources. So that is a right place to play around with the innovative financing. And I would say when we look at the traditional tools, the way most of the investor or funder would like to invest, it might be equity, it might be debt, it might be combination of both, or it might be a grant, or otherwise convertible instrument in between grant and investment. So I would say to take care of the early stage risk, innovative finance can boost that confidence into rest of the investor who are waiting to see the risk mitigation in early stage. And there can be a ideal combination of convertible grant or equity investment where it is dependent on mutually agreed indicators. So as we talk about ESG, as we talk about the formal structure of reporting around the climate and environment, in the early stage, we can co-design meaningful indicators with the venture itself, what it really means to achieve some outcome and how are they planning to measure the outcome without putting so much effort and without putting so much additional resources. So basically that looks like a pathway towards net zero or pathway towards climate measurement. And at that stage it becomes the key component of innovative finance because we can assign those key indicators and achievements in terms of tying up that indicators with the release of next tranche of investment. So for example, if there is a milestone of emission reduction with early stage venture, we can co-design the investment into different tranches and we can ensure that it is being monitored, it is being going on the right track in terms of progress, in terms of impact that we are developing as a part of that venture. So I would say that is one example where it can be combined with the impact. And sometimes it's so difficult to understand the impact in initial number of years because the venture might get some visibility after 3 years, after 2 years. So in that case, the innovative finance tool will take the timeline into consideration, and it's different from each solution. It's different from carbon removal venture to energy efficiency venture to some kind of innovative product that somebody is trying to launch and commercialize, because every incubation period is different. So considering that understanding from um, the knowledge holders or from the subject matter expert, if we take them on board during this investment planning, it will really serve their purpose instead of serving the investor's purpose. So I would say that looks like a participatory investment process where the investor, the funder is trying to understand key component and key expectations from the investee itself and the end user itself. When we have that understanding, it becomes more fruitful and it can deliver the impact as desired throughout this relationship.
Great. So I want to shift gears here a little bit to the political and regulatory landscape. But before I go into that, it's a question that popped into my head. I'm curious what you think if the public gets, like the general public, do they get what ESG is? And the reason why I bring that up is because, Julie, you mentioned the Tesla example, right? And I remember Elon Musk was out complaining about his ESG scores, and but he was focusing on the product they make, right? And I was always under the impression from my earlier exposure to ESG tracking that it was more focused on the operations of a company, not necessarily the product. Now, obviously, product is a part of it, but that a large component is how a company behaves and how it operates. And, you know, when Musk was saying that, it made me think that, does he not get that like they're looking at how you operate as a company, not necessarily that you make bad batteries and you enable the clean revolution?
Really good question. I mean, even within the sustainable finance industry, not everyone seems caught up on the fact that ESG is about your operations, how you do things, how you manage the environmental and social risks to your business or to your investment structure. Whereas impact is, what is your product and how is it affecting the world, right? So those are different things. And I think you're right to highlight that not only some corporate CEOs don't quite appreciate the difference, but certainly I don't think the general retail investor is thinking about that kind of distinction. I think a big challenge is people certainly don't understand the scale of finance required, how the industry is shifting. I think a lot of people find finance intimidating, those who aren't working in the industry, certainly unnecessarily, but I think a lot of people find it intimidating. And then when you tie that to climate impacts, which are confusing, vague, I mean, how are we going to think about how different industrial activities will change the atmospheric greenhouse gas concentration, and then that will affect natural cycles? And you try and combine those two things together, finance and climate, and you bring that into different jargon like ESG, impact, all of these nuances that we will deliberate and have strong opinions on. The short answer, Tyler, is I don't think that the general audience or general public is thinking about all of these nuances or really has their head into it. And I guess I'm hesitating here because I don't know if there should. Of course, that's part of the role of why there is a specialized finance industry. But the short answer is no, I don't think they're looking at it the same way we're deliberating here.
Well, Mike, you deal with sophisticated investors, I imagine. Like, do you see that there's still some confusion there?
Yes. Yeah, there's still a lot of confusion. But I do think that it is something that we try to bring value to the market on. We try and educate. We were doing a lot of education 4 or 5 years ago. We're doing probably a little bit less education now as a whole, but we're still doing a lot. I think ESG scores is a big one. I think the opposite to the Tesla example is something like Pepsi that has an amazing ESG score, but they're selling sugar water and contributing towards major healthcare problems around the world and causing more inequalities around the world in many ways with their product. Whereas all the ESG providers give them an amazing score. So for us, we're trying to combine operations with product when we're looking at ESG. So something like Pepsi wouldn't be in our portfolios because of the product. And also something like Tesla wouldn't be in our portfolios because of the operations. It's good to have the combination, but there are many different definitions. So there are many funds that we see as competitors that will just look at operations. So they'll have a Pepsi or they'll have large tech companies, social media companies that have massive social, societal issues that they're causing. But they have amazing ESG within the operation. So anyways, there's a lot of definitions, a lot of education, and things are changing all the time too. And sadly, I know we want to get into politics, but sadly, ESG and climate action is now a political issue, and I don't think it should be. We're all trying to achieve similar goals for most cases, and so why does it have to be a political issue, something that we're fighting about? But but we can get into that later.
Yeah.
And I might add, sorry, Tyler, that a key distinction as we're looking at product versus operations and process on the climate side. I mean, the same is true for many oil and gas companies where they will be ranked high on an ESG on an ESG ranking system, often included in self-labeled ESG funds, because perhaps their ES and or G processes are fine, but of course the product itself is quite literally creating greenhouse gas emissions. So wouldn't be fitting in any way an ESG score when you're looking at positive climate impacts. So I think on the climate side, that's probably the key example of how without clarity on a definition of ESG impact, let's actually move towards creating something sustainable. Oil and gas companies will often be labeled as a thumbs up based on perhaps their background processes, when of course, oil and gas is the leading cause of climate change.
Yeah, that's a super good point, because I do recall rankings where oil and gas companies have ranked in the top 5, sometimes number 1. And it kind of goes to my earlier point about the gaming thing, right? If you game the S and the G, you can come out strong, even though you sell a product that's screwing the climate, basically. So yeah, it's an interesting discussion. Sticking with you, Julie, though, because I said we were going to go to the political and regulatory stuff, and we did touch on it. Mike touched on it. How is that evolving right now? What challenges and opportunities do you foresee for climate finance in Canada specifically, but also globally?
Super. I'll leave the politics side with Mike, and I'll stick to the policy and regulation side of things. Because 2 big cans of worms, and I'll stick to one of them. In short, Canada is behind when it comes to other countries in setting rules and regulations for how the finance sector works when it comes to sustainability. So Europe, UK, many other leading countries and comparable jurisdictions to Canada have set rules to clarify, what does a sustainable investment mean? How do you report on that? How are you mobilizing capital towards the climate transition that all countries have agreed to under the Paris Agreement on climate change? So Canada is about 3 to 5 years behind when it comes to setting rules for the financial sector on climate change. And let's be clear, this isn't something too out of left field. Of course, the financial sector is subject to quite a bit of rules and regulation to make sure that it's working, in the right way. And Canada has rules on climate change. So putting those together is kind of the missing area where Canada needs to be stepping forward. And this is important, to get to that clarity point that we were talking about, for all different types of investors, for retail investors, for institutional investors, to get data from their client that they know they can trust. What is happening so far, the main federal financial regulator recently put in rules for climate disclosure, all the way from your operations through to the end use of your product, what's known as scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. So reporting on emissions will be required for federally regulated financial institutions, like a lot of the banks. But that's really just a first step. What needs to happen next is, companies reporting on that, all different groups, and most importantly, actually moving towards reducing those emissions. So not just counting them, but making sure they're moving in the right direction of emission reduction. And the reason I say that goes to one of the big opportunities on climate change. Like I said, we already have about 1.1 degree of warming that's locked in, and we're seeing pretty dangerous effects from that. That comes back to bite investors. The damages from wildfires, BC's atmospheric rivers on communities is obvious, but making the link to how that affects investment portfolios is also very important. I think that's probably one of the greatest challenges, that in scenarios and models, folks aren't quite appreciating how, for example, a wildfire affects your business, affects your investment, whether it's real estate or a small, medium enterprise. And the effects are quite significant. But then, of course, the best way to reduce those risks is to reduce climate change, right? To reduce the severity of climate change. So investing in emission reduction as an organization, as a company or a fund, is really the best way to ensure those risks aren't as severe in the future. So, the best way to reduce climate-related risks is essentially to reduce the severity of climate change. And that's the opportunity side, to make sure that we stay within 1.5 degrees of warming, and to invest in a way that, you as an organization, a fund, or a business is helping move in that direction. So tying that all into the policy side, Canada's behind, but the trajectory is definitely moving towards increased reporting on climate-related risks and impacts, and then perhaps ideally moving into policy that mobilizes capital for the climate transition and, of course, reduces the risks in the long term.
Okay, I'm gonna be like my mother now, just somebody who doesn't follow this stuff, and I'm gonna ask a question. It's like, okay, like I have stuff invested in portfolios and that. I don't read all of this stuff that's reported on. This doesn't, like, to go through everything that I would own, in terms of stocks, mutual funds, whatever, and read those disclosures. It's like getting those privacy statements for every website that you go to now. Has anybody ever read them? Like, put up your hand if you have. No, everybody just says, okay, but it slows down productivity. It just requires a lot more effort on the part. Are we going to get into a situation where this stuff just becomes ceremonial, but it's not really having an impact because no one's paying attention? Or is it having an impact because those who represent the broadest, I guess, influence over over capital are looking at it? So the more sophisticated institutional investors.
I'll give a quick answer and then invite it to the institutional investor friend on the panel. The short answer is it will only be effective with accountability, right? It's the same thing with financial statements, right? Like, let's use this as a comparison. I think most individual investors, perhaps including your mother, doesn't read the financial statements, the balance sheet, the income statement.
Or myself, frankly. Yeah.
No slight against your mother. I'm sure she's very sophisticated and excellent with math. But most people aren't looking at the financial statements, right? But they still exist, and they're still, checked by the appropriate supervisors in our financial system. So I think the exact same type of model needs to apply to not just climate disclosures about what are my risks, opportunities, and contributions, but actually addressing those risks, opportunities, and contributions. And then we need the system to make sure accountability is in place so that the average retail investor can trust that things are moving in the right direction.
Okay. Namendra, Mike, you got a take on that?
Just wondering, did we lose Namendra?
Yeah, it looks like we did. Guess he didn't like that question.
Yeah. If he comes back, I'll let him jump in. But but just some quick thoughts on that. I think that not everybody is going to be looking at the carbon emissions or environmental stats on a particular investment or a particular company, but we do need transparency for those that do want to look at it. And so most asset owners these days, the large asset owners, are looking at those statistics and are integrating them into their investment policies or their investment process in some way. So I think that's really important. And then there's a large amount of investors, including retail investors, that care more about that than they care more about the financial performance. So there needs to be an opportunity, and it's kind of like a warning label in a way, or the nutritional facts that might be on a food. If you want to make sure that you're doing good for the planet, or in the case of food, doing good to your body, then you do have the opportunity to do that. Whereas now you don't even have the opportunity with a lot of investments to do that if you do want to do it. So we do need transparency, and that's a large part of our engagement that we do with a lot of our investments is pushing for companies to be more transparent about their climate data, because if they're not, then we either have to make estimates or assumptions, or we just need to divest until we have the information. So that's not good for anybody.
Yeah, the food labeling analogy, that's a very good one, actually. So thank you for raising that. Good to have you back, Namendra. We thought you'd abandoned us. Now that we do have you back, I wanted to ask you and Mike, and this goes back to something I asked Mike earlier, about the investor attitudes, and I briefly forgotten it, but I wanted to get back to it. Are investor attitudes changing as well because there's a generational shift happening where, like, younger members of families, whether it's family offices or just families not as much money as family offices, controlling younger people in the families, controlling the money, and having, I guess there's a generational concern there for those who are younger. Are you seeing any of that? Namendra, why don't we go with you? Is your audio on?
Yeah,
Yeah, okay.
apologies for the connection trouble here.
No worries.
I definitely see a change in understanding and the mindset from the investor, from the funder, because new generation, they have seen this climate effect and they understand climate crisis, I would say, from a different mindset as compared to previous generation. They understand the urgency of taking action.
Mhm.
So if you look at the philanthropic available capital, similar to private equity, uh, present generation, they would like to solve this problem within their own generation and not to pass it on to next generation, because they understand this is the problem created in the past and present generation is trying to solve it. So why to wait for next generation to innovate and to design something? Because now we understand that everything is available right now. It's matter of how do we connect different dots. How do we connect the technical innovation with the investment requirement, with the reporting requirement? How do we make a new system that really work to enable the solution mindset rather than looking at the constraint moving forward?
Does that resonate with you, Mike? Are you seeing that? Because I know you mentioned that families are starting to shift their attention to this area, but when you mentioned the word family, I was thinking, like, are they younger people who are, coming to the point of influence, having influence over their family affairs?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, probably 4 or 5 years ago, we saw family offices and family foundations start to give a small amount of capital to the next generation to manage. So maybe it was 5% of the overall portfolio they would give to the next generation to kind of allow them to practice investing, because they're going to be the ones taking over in the future. And in many circumstances, that 5% of the portfolio did much better in terms of performance than the rest of their portfolio, and with no excessive risks or anything like that. And so now we're seeing entire portfolios switching over as the next generation now has more experience. Climate finance has been more proven. There's more long-term track records when it comes to climate finance. So the next generation is starting to take over and move more capital in that direction. And we're also seeing that the other big movement is with women investors.
Interesting.
So women that have had inheritances or have recent divorce or their partner passed away, and now they have a large amount of capital that they now need to decide how they're going to invest, and they're deciding to invest to make a positive impact in the world and make more money. So they're making smart choices and the impactful choices as well. So those are kind of the two big demographic movements that we're seeing when it comes to climate finance.
Okay, sticking on the trends thing, and this is our last question because we only got a minute here. I'm going to ask all of you to just cite, of all the things that we've discussed, maybe something we haven't discussed, what is the most important trend in climate finance that you're seeing right now? And let's go to Namendra to start.
I would say I'm seeing the most important trend is investor community is trying to understand the need, why they need to deploy capital for climate solutions. And it is a mental shift that through climate solution, we are not trying to save the earth as a planet, but basically we are trying to save ourselves as a human society from all the negative effect that is coming in the future. That's my take.
That's a great trend. Julie.
Maybe I'll do 3 rapid fire. The first would be moving from just counting and disclosing your emissions to actually reducing them. So, shifting from just recognizing climate change to trying to reduce its effects. The second would be moving towards a just transition, whatever you want to call it. So tying environmental and social factors together. recognizing that, you know, bringing in people who are previously excluded from economic opportunity is essential as we move to a new economy, and then also ensuring those people who rely on jobs in polluting industries are supported in the transition. And then the last one is hopefully really hammering in that 1.5 degrees is the ceiling rather than 2 degrees. In earlier conversations a couple of years ago, I had people offer, you know, 4 degree or 2 degree scenarios. And I thought, well, both of those are awful. So hopefully hammering in the need to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees and aligning portfolios to achieve that.
Okay, it was 3, cheating a bit, but we'll let it slide. Mike, you got 1 or 3?
I'll go with 2.
Okay.
I think one big trend that I think is very that we're seeing and is very exciting is people moving from traditional portfolios all the way to portfolios focusing on climate adaptation. So rather than slowly moving into mitigation and then to adaptation, as we saw over the past kind of 4 or 5 years, now we're seeing people and investors realizing the urgency, wanting to move right to adaptation. We're seeing a lot of 100% climate impact portfolios being built out of portfolios that had no emphasis on climate or impact before. So I think that's quite exciting. I think the other area that is really moving quickly is engagement with companies. So 3 or 4 years ago, engagement was really an afterthought for most investors. It was just, okay, I invested in my portfolio, now I'll think about some engagement. Whereas now a lot of our bigger potential clients are asking us all about our engagement, asking all about proxy voting as part of their selection process, which I think is great, because that's a way that you can make an enormous impact with your investments, is actually engaging and encouraging these companies to get better. So it's a great trend that's continuing to get better.
Well, it's all good news trends. Thanks to the 3 of you for joining us today. And I thought it was a great, stimulating conversation. And I'll pass it back to whoever I'm passing it back to kick off the next session. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.